Continuing a rainy day morning discussions this morning. Again here, Bob Tassone. Good morning, Bob.
Good morning.
And thank you for joining me here again on this wet, rainy day. It's June 21st, and we are getting a really significant rain event taking place here on this beautiful Wednesday here in Williamsburg. With your Port Financial and Port Insurance Services here. I think this is a great day to talk about the importance of having the right kinds of insurance, of course, for your real estate, and how that applies when we're getting a significant rain event, and what does it mean to have the right coverages, including flood insurance. So proper day to talk about flood insurance and the difference between flood and water types of damage and things like that. So dive right in if you can and tell us a little bit more about this whole thing that we need to know about flood insurance and water damage and so forth.
All right. Well, good morning, John. Just wanted to cover, since water is falling all around us, talk a little bit about water damage, and then the first thing you think of is flood. But water damage, first of all, water is a very powerful force. And anytime you have water coming into your home, it can create damage. I mean, lots of damage. And so if on a day like today, there was a large tree limb to come through your house or through a window or something, and water comes in, that's not a flood. If the water comes in from the sky, basically, then it's not a flood. And so that type of damage, water damage, would be covered by your homeowner's policy. Other things that happen to inside of your home, a sudden break, like your water heater explodes or something like that, a sudden incursion of water is generally covered by homeowner's insurance if it's internal in your house. A slow drip, though, something that's been going on in the wall for a long time, that's generally not covered by homeowner's insurance. So we're talking about different kinds of water damage.
Right. Okay. So a slow drip would be something like something caused by deferred maintenance, perhaps.
Yes. And so that's where it comes into, I mean, we as homeowners, we have certain responsibilities. And one of the responsibilities that we have is to make sure that our pipes are not leaking.
Which is a good reason to have your home inspected from time to time, and certainly to inspect it yourself and to know everything, all the systems that are part of your home. Well, today we're actually in kind of this area here, particularly on the coastal end of Virginia, Tidewater, on the peninsula here, where we happen to have, we can be subjected to flooding from a number of different things. Typically, when we get flooding or flood warnings, it's going to be coastal flooding from high tides, if not tidal surges and things like that. So today we actually have a very high tide. I just got a video from the Gloucester Point here, where the tide is up against a bulkhead on a beach that's usually 5 or 6 feet above tidal level. So we've got some very high tides today. So there certainly could be, I am certain there's some areas today that are facing some potential for some flooding, particularly low-lying areas. But then we also have floods from like heavy rain and the streams. We have a lot of streams here in Williamsburg, James City County, that flow into the Chesapeake Bay. And there's some protections, of course, in place for RPAs and so forth. But talk to me about the different kinds of flooding that we might have, and the importance to make sure you got the right kind of coverages.
Okay, so there's 3 basic types of flooding, which you've just covered or touched on. But the first thing that you have on a day like today would be what's referred to as urban flooding. Sometimes it's called flash flooding.
Okay.
Where there's a heavy rain that the sewage system and the drainage system cannot handle. In other words, we have on every street or anywhere where you live, when it rains, there's water that runs off into culverts. Bless you, John. Anyway, and culverts and sewers and things like that. And when the rain is too heavy for it to handle it, then water can rise from the ground up, and that's a flood.
Yeah.
So sometimes there's a flash flood warning or watch or something because there's a propensity for that. Now, of course, when the tides are high, then there's less place for that water to go. And so sometimes these things work together.
Yeah.
But anyway, urban flooding, flash flooding, and so a lot of times people will say, well, my house is high, I don't have to worry about it. But when you have a flash flood, it can happen in the mountains, it can happen in high elevations. It doesn't really matter if there's drainage that's going through your property, then you're going to have a flood there. So anyway, that's the first kind. The second kind is more of a traditional river type flooding where you have a river or a stream that overflows its banks.
Yeah.
And that can be caused by heavy rain also, but it can be caused by a snow melt. It can be caused by a dam that fails. And so it could be a bright, sunny, dry day, and the dam fails and you have a flood downstream. So flooding is not necessarily associated with a rainy day like today. It could be a dry, sunny day and you have a flood. And then the most common type of flood that you have around here is coastal flooding, what you were talking about. And so when we have a storm, and especially when you think about the Chesapeake Bay is influenced by wind, and sometimes we have a northeast wind, and that will force water into the bay. The wind drives water into the bay, and then the tides are higher because of the wind driving water into the bay. And so anytime that you think about waterfront property in Yorktown or Gloucester, or even in Williamsburg on the James River or wherever, you're going to think about tidal flooding, because when water is driven into the bay, it's driven into the rivers. It's driven into the York River, it's driven into the James River, it's driven into all of these rivers that flow into the bay, and that's what causes tidal flooding. And so the reference point for most of us is Hurricane Isabel. If you were around during Hurricane Isabel, I can't even remember what year it was. It was
That would have been 2003. I think that was 2003 or 2004.
about 20 years ago.
Yep.
I mean, that was the worst tidal flooding that we've had in this area that I've ever seen.
We had that was pretty much a direct hit from a tropical storm. I believe that storm wasn't even a class
hurricane.
category 1 hurricane when it hit here. That was a tropical.
By the time it reached us, it was a tropical storm. But see, the thing that happened with Isabel, and you've seen this in other places like Houston and so forth, it's not only the force of the wind in miles per hour, but the duration of the wind.
Duration, yeah. That storm lingered over us it hit us hard, and it stayed here for a good long while.
And so it just keeps spinning and churning and driving that water into the bay, and that's why we have flooding. It doesn't have to be a 200-mile-an-hour wind to cause that. It could be 70 or 80-mile-an-hour wind.
So it's really important for when you're buying a home or owning a home. There are flood map overlays that are part of the GIS mapping system that anybody can go and kind of determine where their home is or could be in some of these zones. And that kind of thing changes a bit, doesn't it, Bob? I mean, as far as like how who can be affected by these, does that change the type of coverages that you need to make sure you're providing for clients from time to time?
Well, mostly this type of insurance is administered by the National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP. Now, there are also private flood insurance policies, which we don't have time to get into today.
Gotcha.
But the NFIP makes the flood maps, and they make them more they make the flood areas larger because they're trying to raise premium. I mean, the NFIP is operating at a deficit like most things are in the federal government. And so flood premiums are going up and flood zones are expanding. Whether or not they're expanding in reality or is up to you. But you can do things to mitigate your flood insurance premium and your risk of suffering damage in a flood. So, I mean, we can talk about that if you want.
Well, that sounds like it's
Yeah.
probably be a great subject for another day. And I love these conversations and love being able to cover some of these things. These are some important topics for people to be aware of. And I think the main thing is to just know where you live. Most people live on the coast. They know they're exposed. If you're on a coastal area, or if you own a coastal property or a waterfront property, hopefully you know by now whether or not you're required to have flood insurance. And when you buy that property, it's important to understand where those are. It's also important, I believe it's important to work with someone, a real estate agent that understands these coastal areas. And having worked with a lot of waterfront properties, there are certainly some low-lying areas where you're not going to be able to buy a home without having flood insurance. And it's good to know what you're getting into before you get in there, because it's fun to get excited about a home. But when you have a situation where maybe today's not a very extreme day, but at least we're getting some of these high tidal waters. But there could be some extremes at a certain point where you could be at higher risk. I mean, not just your home, but your vehicles, your possessions. You may not be able to stay in that property when we have a major flood event, because there may be a mandatory evacuation. And it's been a long time, but Hurricane Isabel, I was going to say Katrina, but Hurricane Isabel, there were areas in our coastal area when you and I were in Middlesex County. Some of those locations were mandatory evacuations. You could not stay there. They had to label you if you chose to stay, because they wanted to be able to identify you if they had to afterwards.
And then parts of Matthews, Gloucester, York, Poquoson, they all suffered during that storm. And
that was a rough time.
And a lot of those homes have been raised.
Yeah, now you see it. Right.
We've elevated them so that the next time it happens, they're not as subject.
They're protected. Yeah, because there are some low-lying areas that are good to know where you're at, and that is a way to mitigate your flood risk as well. Yep. So that in itself probably creates another whole layer of things that we can talk about in terms of how you can address those properties. For if you have a low-lying home in a low-lying area, it doesn't mean that the house has to be abandoned, but there are ways to help mitigate your risk and that kind of thing. So we'll talk about that on another call, perhaps. Well, hopefully things will be a little milder today and over the weekend as we kind of get past this. But thank you for bringing up the information and the knowledge that we need to make the right decisions to help protect homeowners and protect folks that own real estate. And it's always good to have your information here. So Bob, you're helping a client of mine right now, it sounds like. So I appreciate your help with that.
And thank you for that. Yeah, referral. Yep. Yes.
Absolutely.
Right.
Well, good to have you again on this call. I'll let you get about your day, and we'll do this again here pretty soon, probably next week, and we'll talk to you later.
All right, John. Take good care. See you.
You too. Bye.